To start. All right, so hello everyone, and welcome to our Integrated Learning 101, How to Help College Students Connect Learning Across Contexts author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I am happy to introduce author Jim Barber. Dr. Barber is a Senior Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Associate Professor of Education at William & Mary. He is an expert in the areas of college student development, assessment of student learning, and integrative learning. Prior to his faculty appointment, he worked in student affairs administration for nearly a decade, specializing in fraternity and sorority affairs, residence life, and student activities. Dr. Barber also has substantial experience with globalization and international education. His latest book is Facilitating the Integration of Learning, 5 Research-Based Practices to Help College Students Connect Learning Across Disciplines and Lived Experience. It was published October 2020 by Stylus. This book offers a guide for college educators on how to promote students' integration of learning and help them connect knowledge and insights across contexts, whether in class or out of class, in co-curricular activities, or across courses and disciplinary boundaries. So welcome today, Dr. Jim Barber.
Patty, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to join you in this webinar today, and appreciate the very kind introduction. So I'd like to start with my pandemic philosophy. So this is taken from my syllabus. I teach a class on integration of learning, and I added this to my syllabus this year just to kind of put things into context and capture my philosophy about how we're going to work together and make it through this season of pandemic. And I don't know who out there needs to hear this, but I thought it would be a great place to start because I think it is relevant to all of our lives. And so we are in the midst of a global pandemic that has turned our world and our lives upside down. Personal and professional responsibilities are blurred and often unpredictable. We're in this together, and in this course, we will offer support, grace, and kindness to one another. And I think this philosophy really goes hand in hand with my view of integrated learning, that when we think about integrated learning, as we'll discuss this afternoon, we're looking at people in a holistic way, that you're not just a student in a particular class, but you're a whole person that brings lots of experiences and expertise to whatever you're doing. And I think that in this time of pandemic, we've really gotten to see a glimpse of people's lives in a different way, whether we're students, whether we're staff, administrators, faculty. We get to see a little bit of people's homes. We get to see people's kids and pets and all the things that go on a daily basis. And so this has been my philosophy of the year, and I think it's a great place to start. Next, I want to share with you my learning manifesto. And so these are my core beliefs about learning that really are the foundation, not only of the way I think about integrated learning, but the way that I approach my job as a faculty member and administrator at William & Mary. I believe that our students are learning all the time, everywhere. It is not limited to a college campus or classroom. Our students come to college with valuable knowledge already. Most students have at least 18 years of experience. Some of our students have much more experience. And so they are certainly not blank slates when they come to us in higher education. And then lastly, I believe that our students will be more successful in college and in life if they can integrate their learning. So I think that students who can make these kind of connections across contexts easily are at an advantage, both in their studies as well as in their careers. And so those are my 3 tenets of learning that really make up the core of my beliefs in student learning. So I've had the great privilege to study this idea of integrated learning over the last 15 years formally, and really over the last 25 years in my work in higher education. As Patty mentioned, I had a book that was just published about 6 months ago that pulls together my ideas about integration of learning as well as research that I've done over the course of the last 15 years. And so what I want to talk about today are some of those highlights from the book and show you some practical examples. My hope is that you'll be able to jot down some ideas that you're able to put into action right away. So later today or tomorrow or this week, my goal is always that you have something really practical that you can use in your job that you take away from the talks today. So my agenda for today, I want to introduce my integration of learning model and explain how that was developed through research and explain how you might use it in your work with students. I'll detail 5 practices that college educators can use to help students integrate learning. And then lastly, I'll leave you with a matrix for planning and assessing integration of learning. And so this is a handout that will drop in the chat and something that you can download and use for your own practice. I want to be really intentional about the language that I use. And so you can see that I've used the term there, college educator. I look at that term really broadly. And so when I say college educator, I'm not only talking about faculty members or instructors in a classroom. I'm thinking broadly about student affairs professionals, administrators, coaches, tutors. I really use that term to talk about anybody who is working to support student learning on the college campus. And so this talk and this book are certainly not limited to one or another of those groups. I really look at college educators quite broadly. And so I hope that you can find yourself in that definition. So in terms of integration of learning, I think often when we talk about student learning, first thing that people go to is, what's your major? What courses are you taking? Tell me about what books you're reading. We focus on the academic part of the experience. And that certainly is important, but we know that that's not the only kind of learning, or the only place where learning is happening for college students, right? Students are also living where they learn. That might be in a residence hall, it might be at their home or family, it might be in an apartment or a house adjacent to campus, but we know that students are also learning where they live. Students are also learning through campus recreation, athletics. There's a lot of learning that's going on the academic field or on the track. Students also do a ton of learning from their family. So they're learning at home, they're learning from their family culture, and those are important aspects of knowledge that students are bringing with them to the college environment. Students are learning in internships and other professional work experiences. They're learning in student organizations, clubs, fraternities and sororities, leadership organizations, honoraries, lots of ways that our students are involved in their learning in those environments as well. And so what I saw early on in my career as a student affairs professional, I worked in residence life, fraternity sorority life, leadership programs, and I could see in my meetings with students that they were able to connect what they were doing in these different environments with what they were doing in their coursework. And so I would often see students who were saying, well, I'm in this leadership role as the treasurer of my student group, and I'm a finance major. And so I can see how those things are interplaying. I saw that happening all the time, and those kind of conversations with students always really got me excited, because I could see that what I was doing as a student affairs professional, student advisor, was linked to what students were doing in their academic coursework, and I appreciated that. I know that students are also connecting across those different environments. So it's not just that they're connecting what they're doing with their courses, they're also connecting those things to one another. So we what we end up with is a web of student learning where students are able to make connections across all of these different contexts and environments, which I think is really exciting. It gives us a holistic view of student learning. And so as I began to research this kind of learning, because I was a little disappointed when I made a transition into my doctoral program. We wanted to dig into this idea, and there wasn't a ton written about this kind of learning. And so I decided that I was going to study it. And the definition that I came to from my initial research is what you see here. So integration of learning is a demonstrated ability to connect, apply, and or synthesize information coherently from disparate contexts and perspectives and make use of these new insights in multiple contexts. So admittedly, that is a mouthful. What does that really mean? It means the kind of learning that I just illustrated on that last slide, that students are able to make those connections between what they're learning in different areas of their life and take what they're learning in those areas and bring it together. So it's not just a simple transaction of transferring learning from one place to another, but they're really being able to bring what they're learning together to form new insights and perspectives, and then use those moving forward. And so I want to shed a little bit of light on where this definition and where this concept grew from. And so I was really fortunate as a doctoral student to be a researcher with the Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education, which is a very cool research study that followed a group of students, a cohort of students on 6 different college campuses over the course of 4 years. And so from 2006 to 2009, we followed the same group of students who were progressing from their first year in college through their 4th year of college. And you can see in the table there that we started with a group of 315 students, and 117 of those students persisted for 4 years in our study, which was really remarkable. We collected a total of 924 interviews. Like I said, I was part of a research team. I certainly did not conduct over 900 interviews by myself, but was able to be a part of collecting and analyzing a number of those. And it was from analyzing a subset of those interviews that I developed this model of integrative learning. And that started out looking at these interviews line by line and just reading through and identifying examples where I saw students were connecting learning. And then further analyzing and sorting those examples of integration to come up with a model of how I saw students growing in this way that they were integrating over time. And so what I came up with from that analysis was 3 major ways that students were integrating learning. And so connection, application, and synthesis. Those were 3 words that were highlighted in that definition that I shared with you a couple of slides ago. And those are the 3 ways, the 3 approaches that I found students were able to integrate learning through the interviews that we did with the Wabash study. And I want to spend some time talking about what these 3 categories are and how they're distinct from one another. And so connection is the kind of least involved way of integrating. Establishing a connection, it can be fleeting. It can be something where a student just realizes that 2 things are similar. It could be an example of where a student says, oh, when I'm reading in this class, it made me think of a book that I read in high school. Or what I'm doing in this class reminds me of something that I did in the next class. It doesn't have to be super complex. It often is just a recognition that things are similar. And it can be fleeting. It's not something that necessarily the student dwells on, but it is forming that connection. Application is a bit more involved. And so these are ordered in order of complexity, from least complex to more complex. And application is actually taking something that was learned in one environment or one context and using it somewhere else. And so an example that I see often, both in the interviews and in my own teaching, is I teach a freshman writing class, and I love teaching that class. And one of the things that comes up year after year is that students sometimes learn a 5-paragraph essay formula, and it works really well in high school. It is what they are, taught to do and trained to do, but it doesn't quite fit when they get to college. But it still is an example of application because they're taking that framework that was learned in high school and applying that to their college context. Now they often realize that's not sufficient for college writing. There's more that we need to learn, but it still is that idea of application where you're taking something learned in one environment, using it somewhere else. And then lastly, synthesis is the most complex, most creative approach to integration of learning. And what that is students taking things that are learned in 2 or more contexts and bringing them together in a way that they see something in a new way. And so bringing together ideas, knowledge, skills from multiple different experiences or environments and bringing them together to form a new perspective or to see a new whole. I call that category synthesis of a new whole, because it really is bringing things together that become more than just the sum of their parts. And so I know that some of you who are in the webinar today know me, and if you know me in real life, you know that I'm a huge aficionado of student development theory. I love student development theory. I teach about student development theory. I get really excited about exploring these ideas about how people learn and grow over time. And so, of course, as I was thinking about these ideas of integrating learning, I was thinking about a stage model and thinking about Perry's model of cognitive development and other models of development in various domains that were really influential to me. And so I thought, well, maybe this is a stage model where students first get really good at connecting learning, and then once they get good at that, they move on to application and they get really good at that, and then they kind of master that and move on to synthesis. And what I found as I was analyzing those interviews and really picking apart the different examples that students were sharing about their experiences in college, I found that wasn't the case at all. And so I was a little bit disappointed because the initial ideas and framework that I had in mind weren't playing out. So that was a little frustrating. But the further that I kept going, I realized that it was a model that was more like this. That as students became more complex thinkers, as they advanced developmentally, they became more adept at using all 3 of those approaches together. And so what I like about this graphic is that it shows how they overlap. It shows how these ideas of connection and application and synthesis are overlapping. And if I was more skilled as an animator or a graphic designer, I would have this motion. I would add motion where you could see these triangles come apart and come back together to see that they can at times be more distinct, or maybe you have 3 triangles to represent those 3 approaches that are overlapping just a little bit, or they could become very much overlapping where you have all 3 that really are coming together into one. And so maybe that may be a topic for a future webinar or a future approach. But that's the idea, is that this model is not a stage model at all, but one that represents student learning as complex, and that students don't abandon connection or application as they get good at it. they are able to use it in concert, as well as getting better at synthesis. Now, another thing that I realized as I was working through this research and then in my practice as a faculty member later, is that reflection really is a key practice that underscores this whole idea that without the ability um, to reflect, without the time to reflect, it really is difficult to integrate learning. And I am a firm believer that we as a society, and certainly we as higher education professionals, as students, as administrators, as faculty, we don't give ourselves enough time to reflect. We just don't. And I think that the pandemic conditions over the last 15 months or so have really even exacerbated that. That you know, in the times before pandemic, at least we had maybe 5 minutes to walk down the hall from one meeting to the next and take a breath and think about how am I making sense of what just happened in that meeting? How am I getting ready for what I'm walking into next? Now we don't even have that time. We just end one meeting on Zoom and push a button and go into the next. And so I think at this point in life, in this season of pandemic, we really need to be even more intentional about giving ourselves time to reflect, because that, as I said, I think is really the foundation to this integration of learning model. And so I want to stop at this point. I've done a lot of talking. I want to welcome any questions in the chat box. I see one question that has come in through the Q&A. And so I'm not sure if this is also on my screen share, but let me take a look and see if I can read this out to the group and then respond to it. And we'll welcome any questions or comments that you have in the chat. We have one question that says, beyond the use of e-portfolios, are there other model examples or programs that you've come across at colleges or universities that have students considering and demonstrating how they have linked their curricular, co-curricular, and life experiences? And so my answer to that question is going to be to hold that thought, that the next section of the webinar is going to get into some specific strategies for promoting integration of learning, but not going as far as citing examples of great campus practice that's out there already. So what I'm going to do for that portion of answering the question is to ask those of you who are participating in the webinar in a few minutes to share your examples of good practice that you're doing on your campuses around integration of learning and specifically capturing those experiences, because that's what I read in that question is how are you kind of facilitating and then capturing this in the form of an e-portfolio or some other means, right? And as we were kind of chatting leading up to the webinar, I saw one example from Barton College in North Carolina, and so I would encourage folks at Barton to drop that example in the chat again for folks who may not have been in there in the webinar at that point, and would encourage all of us along the way. Please feel free to have those conversations going on simultaneously in the chat. Like Patty said, we're going to archive that chat and that'll be available to everybody afterwards. And so if you have comments or even drop links, if you have links to websites or resources on your campuses, I would love to see that kind of conversation happening in parallel to the talk today. I don't take offense at that, and it doesn't make me think that you're not paying attention to the webinar at all. I have a message from Chris Beyer, who I know in real life. Hi, Chris. And Chris is asking, how common is synthesis? Is this something that most college seniors do, or a skill that only a rare few develop? And so I would say that it is pretty common as students are progressing in their college careers, and so it's more common for seniors than it is for first year students. It's not exclusive to seniors or juniors. There certainly are some first year students who have the ability to synthesize, and that goes both ways. There's also some seniors who really struggle with that. And so I think that we see students able to grow in their complexity in terms of how they integrate learning over time. And what I'm going to talk about next are some practices, 5 practices that I think we can use as educators to help students learn to integrate learning earlier. And so my dream, my vision, Chris, is that we can have students starting from the day they um, first engage with us as incoming students, whether that's in person, whether that's virtually these days, however that is, that we are starting in with some practices that can help them start to learn these approaches to integration of learning and really building that into everything that we're doing. And so that's really the next section of the webinar is going to be walking through 5 practices that I've um, developed through my research to guide us as a profession, to guide us as educators, and helping students to do this better. Okay. And so what those 5 practices are mentoring, writing, juxtaposition, hands-on experiences, and diversity and identity. And so what I want to do for the next segment of the webinar is to walk through each of these practices one by one. And I want to give you kind of a heads up of how I've organized things to just so you have a sense of how things will play out. So for each of these 5 practices, um, what I have as an organizer for us is this table with 4 different columns. And so what the first 3 columns are is what does this practice look like in terms of those 3 approaches? So what does mentoring look like at the connection approach? How does that show up in application? How does that look in synthesis? And those 3 columns are compiled for you in a handout that has been shared already in the chat, and we'll share that for you again. And so don't worry about kind of taking that all in, because I know it's a lot of text. You'll have that as a handout to download and take with you after the fact. And so what I want to focus on in the talk this afternoon are the strategies. And so I want to talk through some practices, some good approaches that I've seen both in the research and in my work, in my practice, that have been effective in this way. And so I want to spend most of our time kind of sharing out those central strategies, and would welcome you to add in the chat any great ideas or approaches that you've taken on your campuses as well. So that's how we'll proceed, and I'll jump right in with mentoring. And so what I mean by mentoring is really relationships with students. And so I write about in the book that I realize this is a really broad continuum. And so mentoring, is a term that is used quite broadly, but I think, you can have an advising relationship with a student where you may see that student once a semester for 30 minutes, where they come in and chat with you about what they're going to register for in the next semester. On the other side of the continuum, you may develop really in-depth relationships with students that are lifelong, that go on long after the student walks across the stage at graduation, and really become lifelong mentoring relationships. I think what I found in the research is that all of the above are effective. What I saw students really um, hungry for are connections with educators, faculty, staff, coaches, um, etc. One of the things that stands out to me vividly, even years after these interviews, is um, that in these interviews for the Wabash study, we would sit down one-on-one with students for 60 to 90 minutes. So these were in-depth interviews with students. And often, you know, the interviewer would ask the student, well, tell me about what you're learning, or tell me what the significant experiences have been over the last year. And students would respond, oh, nobody's ever asked me that before. And it just would like um, cut to the, cut to my soul when I would hear a student say, oh, nobody's ever asked me what I'm learning. And so that's what I think of in terms of mentoring is just even a 5-minute interaction or a 15-minute interaction with a student where you take the time to say, hey, what are you learning? Tell me a little bit about, what you're doing or what you're studying. That can make all the difference to a student. And so in terms of sample strategies, number one is just seeking student interaction. If you work in residence life, or if you are a faculty member who is teaching students day in and day out, you have that interaction built in. If you are an administrator or a staff member who may not have that frontline interaction with students, then you need to find a way to seek out that student interaction. Um, it, in an in-person environment, that may be, walking through the halls and striking up conversations. It might be going to the coffee shop. It might be having lunch at the dining hall, and just seeking out places to interact. Certainly scheduling times to check in. That's something that I think has grown increasingly important in pandemic, is that we don't have those collisions where we just kind of randomly run into somebody the way that we used to. And so scheduling a time to check in with somebody, on FaceTime or Zoom, those students that you want to see how they're doing. And over and above, just demonstrating care. So the thing that I found in those conversations with students is um, that they were really appreciative of educators who just cared about them. And so when I look at this category of mentoring, that's what it boils down to for me, is expressing care for students, for what they're learning and for them as people. The second practice to help students integrate learning is writing. And so this is a practice that is near and dear to my heart. It is something that I advocate for in everything that I do. I was an English major as an undergraduate. I am somebody who really enjoys writing, and I appreciate writing as a way of making meaning that can be totally private in terms of something like journaling or just writing things down to try to make sense of it all. Or it can be public, where you are communicating with others, where you're writing things for publication that may communicate your ideas not just to others who are contemporary to you, but may communicate your ideas about things over generations. And so writing, like mentoring, has a really long continuum. Um, One of my favorite strategies for using writing to promote integration of learning is through structured reflection. And so one of the links that will be in the chat is a series of reflective prompts that I've used in my first year writing class to help students integrate learning. And so I would, as a regular practice in my classes, set aside time for students just to reflect and write. This took on many different forms. So in some classes, this was pen to paper writing, where I would, hand out a piece of paper to everybody at the end of class and say, I want you to spend the last 15 minutes of class just considering this prompt and just free write it. I collect those to read, but I tell students, like, I'm not looking at your spelling, I'm not looking at your grammar, I'm not looking at, um, if you're writing in full sentences. I want you just to get your ideas and your thinking on paper. In some classes, I would do this via Twitter, where same idea. At the end of the class, I want you to tweet at least one thing that you learned, where students, have that practice of like, okay, what am I learning? Sometimes I would add in prompts to say, tweet about how this is connected to something that we did last week, or how this is connected to your readings, or what you're doing in your graduate assistantship, or those types of things. And so building in the time, though, I think is what's most important. So giving students the time, whether it's in class, whether it's in an organizational meeting, whether it's in a hall meeting, whatever it is, making the time for students to write is key. Formal assignments are one way to do this. I don't think it's the only way. I don't think it's always the best way, but certainly you can do a lot of integration of learning in a formal, 15 to 25 page research paper. Of course you can do that. I think you can also do that on social media. Like I said, I use Twitter for class quite a bit to help students pull their thoughts together. Um, and my perspective is that I think that students today are actually writing more than students ever have, because constantly um, we're texting, we're posting things on social media, we're communicating in written form all the time. It's not always an APA style, which is okay, but it's still a form of writing as a way of pulling ideas together. And so that's what I would think about in terms of some sample strategies. The next practice is probably the one that I get the most questions about, because I think it's an interesting title. I think it's a word that we don't use a ton in terms of um, higher education or student learning, and it's one that I really um, like to talk about, because what I find is that people are using juxtaposition in education quite a bit, but we don't always formalize it in the way that we talk about it, or the term that we use. And so what I mean by juxtaposition is putting two or more things side by side that may conflict, that are not the same, that may raise some interesting contrasts. And so those situations are ones in which students have to wrestle with those two things side by side. It's often uncomfortable to have things side by side that are not compatible. You can likely think about your own experience as a student, as an educator, and think about examples where this was the case for you. Um, Certainly, in terms of strategies, group discussions are really effective ways to engage students in juxtaposition. Um, a formal way of doing that is through a debate in a class, or in an organization meeting, where you kind of structure it where students are, assigned to take different perspectives or different sides of an issue, and then, kind of convince the other side that they're right. Um, that can be challenging for students, especially if they're randomly assigned to a perspective that they don't, personally believe in. But that idea of group discussions or debate in some way of verbally kind of talking through those ideas of juxtaposition. How do you make sense of two things that are in conflict, or in contrast? Playing devil's advocate is another way that educators can kind of facilitate this process. And so one of the things that I've seen in my own experience is that often in classes or in student organizations, there's a couple loud voices, there's a couple dominant folks who jump in early, um, can be um, influential, and so they kind of set the stage for the whole conversation. I think as an educator, you can come into those conversations as a devil's advocate and say, okay, well, we're getting some groupthink around this particular idea, what if we look at it from this perspective? Or have you thought about what this would mean for somebody from a different background or a different perspective, and try to facilitate that juxtaposition in a conversation that may be going, one that may be becoming one-sided really quickly. Um, and then lastly, I think that passive programming is another great way of bringing juxtaposition into your practice. And so certainly, like one of the things that comes to mind is bulletin boards. Like I said, I've worked in the past in res life, and so bulletin boards are something that I always see as a really effective way of programming. But I know there's lots of other ways to do passive programming that are not bulletin board focused, especially in the last year or so. Hands-on experiences are the fourth approach, the fourth practice. And what I want to say in terms of hands-on experiences are that far and away study abroad experiences and field trips were the most frequent examples that students talk about in terms of hands-on experience. In the past year, a lot of those experiences have not been able to happen as they traditionally have, and have had to be transformed. Educators have been extremely creative in how they've transformed experiences that required changing space or place, and made those really high quality experiences in a virtual format. I think role-playing activities can also be really good examples of hands-on experiences. Maker spaces are more and more common on college campuses. I know we have several at William and Mary, and so the idea of giving students an opportunity to put what they're learning into action is really what hands-on boils down to in terms of practices. And I want to move to the fifth practice. I'm also watching the clock there, so I want to be mindful of time. Diversity and identity is the fifth practice that is extremely important in terms of facilitating integration of learning. And so I want to pull this apart and talk about what I mean here. And so what I mean by diversity and identity, and why I see these two as interwoven, is both that we want to build diverse groups, build opportunities for interactions between students with different backgrounds, different identities, different perspectives. At the same time, we want to acknowledge and welcome students to bring their full identities, their true identities into educational experiences. I think about this and I talk about this in terms of opening the door for students to bring their identities, bring their prior learning, bring their experiences into the classroom, into their residence hall, into their student organizations in a way that students may not always feel welcomed to do. And so being explicit about how we value diversity and identity and welcome that into our educational experiences, I think is key here. In terms of sample strategies for actually doing this, we can create diverse groups. Depending on what your role is on campus, this is going to vary. If you work in admission in some way, you have a very different power to create diverse groups in terms of creating structural diversity on our campuses, within individual programs, etc. Not everybody has an influence in terms of the admission process. But certainly we can all ask students about their homes, about their families. We can model that by sharing our own identities, our own experiences from outside of higher ed if we're comfortable doing so. But modeling that in interactions with us in the educational experiences that I'm putting together, I encourage you to bring those aspects of yourself here, because I think that who you are influences how you learn. And so I think that you learn better when you can bring your whole self to the experience. And that goes hand in hand with inviting higher learning. And so I think we need to be really explicit about, um, again, opening the door and inviting those 18 plus years of learning that students have and bringing that into their experiences with us in the higher ed environment. Okay, and so I've got the 10-minute warning, so we will bring it home here and leave some time at the end for some questions, comments. So what I'm doing here on this slide is breaking every single rule that folks will tell you about slides and about visual representation, in that it's hard to read, there's a ton of text, it's hard to discern what's going on here. Please don't fear. What is represented here is the table that you have access to in the link that's been provided. And what this is just a compilation of the last 5 slides. And so this matrix shows the 5 practices for integrative learning along the vertical axis, and then the 3 approaches to integration of learning horizontally. And so it shows what these experiences, what these practices, I should say, would look like across these different approaches to integration. I show it here just to illustrate that these different tables that I've reviewed over the last 5 slides go together into a more comprehensive document. I want to talk on the next slide about how I propose that we use this as a tool. And so I look at this as a planning matrix, and I think that there are 2 different ways that this can be used. There's maybe more. I think about it in 2 ways. And you'll notice that on the handout, it's 2 pages. So one page is has the descriptions filled in there for you. This is also a chapter in the book about this too. And so I'm kind of giving broad strokes here. The second page is blank, where it's just the blank matrix, where I want you to be able to fill in those blanks either with kind of check marks like I'm visualizing here for you. Like I envision that you could use this as kind of a self-check of your organization, your course, your fill in the blank for your educational experience with students. And look for where you're giving students the opportunity to integrate. And so it may look like it does on the screen here. You may go through your experience and say, okay, I'm offering some connection in terms of mentoring. We're doing connection and application in terms of writing, juxtaposition. We're doing application synthesis, so on and so on. I don't think that for any one experience, you need to check all these boxes. I don't think it's that simple. And I don't think that we always need to be all things to all people. What I'm looking for in this kind of self-check is just an eyeball to see kind of, are you hitting across the board here and offering a handful of opportunities? Are you offering several? My experience and my guess is that in your interactions with students, you're probably doing a lot of these things. You may not think about them in these words and these terms that we're using today. But I think that they're a part of your practice, and formalizing that in a way where you can show to your students and show to others, show to your colleagues, this is how I'm helping students to integrate learning. I think that's helpful in terms of planning and assessment. I think another way that you can do this is not by just using check boxes, but also by using this as kind of a way to fill in kind of some brief descriptions where you could assess individual students on their skills, how they can integrate in these different aspects, or use it as a way to kind of document as a form of evidence how students are making progress in this over time. Maybe you sit down with individual staff members that you supervise as RAs, for example, and kind of fill this out at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year to show development and growth in terms of how students can integrate. So I think it can be used in that way as a type of rubric as well. as well as a planning matrix. Okay, so with 5 minutes to spare, um, we have a couple of questions that are in the Q&A box. I'm going to start with the first one that I see, and then and there it is in the chat there as well. And then we will go from there. I certainly am glad to stick around after the 2 o'clock Eastern time as well, if anybody wants to chat in the chat box. And so the question is, diversity has become so politicized with Boise State abruptly canceling its diversity classes. Is it now more risky for faculty to include diversity and identity in the mix? I don't know about risk. I think it's ever more important for faculty and all college educators individually to express to students that these things are important and that student identities and diversity is valued in the educational experiences that you're facilitating. And again, I'm not limiting that to faculty or academic coursework, I think broadly. But I think even when institutionally there may be risk or there may be limitations in terms of what curriculum may be offered or what the institutional stance may be, I think we as educators can be explicit about our values as individuals and how we value students' perspectives, identities, and the diversity, that they may bring to their experience. And so I appreciate the question, and I think that it is even more important. Before we reach the very end, I want to leave you with a challenge. And so in the last 2 minutes here, I want to give you some homework. I believe that as college educators, we have the power to facilitate integration of learning for students. I think as a field, we're not always the best at training educators to do this. Like I said a few minutes ago, I think by instinct, a lot of educators do this work, but we don't do a lot of training around this. And so I want to acknowledge that, and that really is a part of my passion and mission, is that I want to get these ideas out there in the field of higher education broadly. I want you to think about what is one thing that you can do in the next week to promote integration of learning for the students on your campus. You don't have to revamp your entire curriculum. You don't have to start from scratch and rebuild, your job description. Just do one thing out of these 5 practices in the next week. And I would love to hear from you either via email or Twitter or any other way that you know to contact me. I love to talk about these ideas. Obviously, I could talk for another couple of hours about that. I won't do that today, and I'll turn it over to Patty at this point to wrap us up. But do want to say, please reach out if I can be of help, and thanks again for your time today.
All right, everyone. Thank you to author Jim Barber for offering his time and presenting this webinar with us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who turned in live with us today. If you are interested in ordering the book, Facilitating the Integration of Learning, use code IOL21 at the Stylist Pub website, and that gives you 20% off the book and free shipping. All right, lots of thank yous. Great job today, everyone. Again, thank you again to Dr. Jim, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.